In the late 19th century, when the Santa Clara Valley was still a patchwork of orchards, open fields, and quiet country roads, a new presence began to rise among the rolling vineyards. It appeared slowly at first, just the outline of a foundation, a frame of timber, the suggestion of symmetry where there had once been only soil and vines. Yet even in these early stages, it was clear that this house would not be content to blend into the landscape. Something about its proportions, its careful placement on the hill, suggested intention, ambition, a desire to endure. Charles and Ellen Baldwin, the couple behind this creation, were not simply building a residence. They were establishing a legacy. Their land stretched across acres of fertile valley floor, soil rich enough to sustain an entire wine-producing empire. The Baldwins had already begun shaping that dream, importing vines from Bordeaux, constructing an enormous stone winery, carving out underground cellars that would one day become part of the foundations of a modern college campus. Their Beaulieu label would soon appear far beyond California, making its way into New York parlors and London clubs. But to the Baldwins, the estate needed something more than vineyards and storage vaults. It needed a heart, a symbol, a place that told visitors that Beaulieu was not simply a business venture, but a world unto itself. They turned not to local ranch houses or the practical architecture common in California at the time, but to Europe, to a vision drawn from the gardens of Versailles and the elegance of the French courts. For reasons both personal and aspirational, they imagined their future home as a reflection of aristocratic refinement, a structure that would echo the calm, geometric order of French neoclassicism. Architect Willis Polk was tasked with bringing this vision across the ocean, interpreting the grandeur of old-world estates within the frontier spirit of the West Coast. As the frame took shape, neighbors whispered about the unusual design, tall, balanced facades, straight lines meeting in perfect symmetry, redwood boards arranged in a distinctive V-pattern, a construction style almost never seen in the region, and above all, the graceful proportions that hinted at a famous inspiration. The Trianon structures built for the French monarchs centuries earlier. For the Baldwins, the reference was deliberate. It suggested elegance and permanence. It suggested that Beaulieu was not just a vineyard, but a destination, a place where guests would step out of their carriages and feel, for a moment, as though they had arrived somewhere beyond the boundaries of the valley. When the exterior finally emerged from its scaffolding, crowned with white stucco finishes that mimicked quarried stone, the house felt almost transported from another world. The surrounding vineyards embraced it like a natural amphitheater. The wind carried the scent of ripening grapes across the terrace. And inside, the rooms waited, wide, airy, and lit by generous windows, to host conversations, celebrations, and the rhythms of daily life that give a home its soul. The Baldwins themselves saw the estate as the beginning of something long-lasting, a place where hospitality would flourish alongside barrels of aging wine. They welcomed visitors with a generosity that became well known in the area, guiding them through cool underground chambers filled with bottles destined for distant cities. Evenings were spent on the veranda, looking over vines imported from France, vines that tied their California dream to the traditions of European winemaking. It was in this combination of cultural influence, agricultural success, and architectural ambition that the foundation of the estate's mythology quietly took shape. No one could have guessed then that this house, born from a mixture of refinement and rural promise, would eventually survive upheavals, relocations, and changing eras. To the people who first stepped across its threshold, it was simply a beautiful residence in a beautiful place. But in the way the light struck its facade at dusk, or how the long shadows of the vines reached toward its walls, there was already a suggestion of endurance, a quiet hint that this creation, rooted in European inspiration and California soil, had been built with the intention of outlasting the world around it. And so, as the valley shifted through seasons and the Beaulieu vineyard expanded across the land, the mansion stood at its center, breathing life into a story that had only just begun. The mansion rose from the California landscape with a confidence that felt almost foreign, as if it had arrived from another world rather than being built board by board on the Baldwin estate. Its proportions were too measured, its symmetry too deliberate, its presence too regal to resemble the rustic homes scattered across the Santa Clara Valley. Travelers who passed the property found themselves slowing their horses or turning their heads from carriage windows, wondering why a residence inspired by the formal gardens of Versailles was standing among orchards and vineyards on the American West Coast. This unlikely vision had taken shape under the direction of architect Willis Polk, a young designer whose talent lay not in imitation, but in translation. He did not simply copy European motifs. He reimagined them for a dramatically different setting. When Charles and Ellen Baldwin shared their desire for a house that felt refined, timeless, and unmistakably French, Polk turned toward the architecture of the Grand Trianon, its clear geometry, its harmonious lines, and its balance between grandeur and intimacy. He saw in the Trianon not just a style, but a language, one that could give the Baldwin estate a quiet authority while remaining scaled to the California landscape. What emerged was a structure that appeared both familiar and transformed. Tall pilasters traced the facade, catching the sunlight along clean vertical lines. Elegant window shutters framed each opening with the precision of a chateau, and the roofline carried the calm composure of European aristocratic homes. The building stood neither oversized nor modest. Instead, it projected an effortless grace, as though it had always belonged to this land despite its foreign lineage. The materials chosen for the project added another layer to its character. Polk selected local redwood, abundant, resilient, and fragrant, yet shaped it into an unusual V-patterned construction that was almost never used in the region. The technique added texture and rhythm to the walls, turning natural timber into something that resembled carved stone from a distance. When finished with smooth stucco, the mansion took on a pale sheen that shifted with the day's light, hinting at marble even though its frame was rooted firmly in California's forests. This rare combination of redwood artistry and European influence made the house unlike anything nearby, a singular architectural experiment that still felt remarkably cohesive. Around it, the Baldwin vineyards stretched outward in orderly rows, creating a natural frame that emphasized the estate's symmetry. The house seemed to watch over the vines like a guardian, elevated slightly above the land, so that every angle revealed a new harmony between architecture and nature. Guests arriving for tastings or dinners would often pause before entering, struck by how this French-inspired mansion seemed at once bold and perfectly at ease in its surroundings. Yet, even as Polk's creation settled into its role as the centerpiece of the Beaulieu estate, its story was far from complete. The mansion was beautiful, yes, and undeniably distinctive, but it was also waiting for the next chapter, for the next owner who would see not just the house's elegance, but its potential as a stage for an entirely new level of grandeur. And soon, that arrival would come in the form of a woman whose fortune, ambition, and taste for the spectacular would link her destiny to this quiet California Trianon in ways no one could have predicted. By 1909, the mansion had already settled into the landscape like a finely cut jewel, its French lines softened by California sunlight, and its rooms quietly holding the memory of the Baldwin years. Then, almost suddenly, the estate felt a shift, an arrival that would transform its identity far more dramatically than any architectural renovation ever could. A new owner stepped into its story, and with her came an energy the house had never known. Harriet Pullman Carolan approached the property not as a simple buyer, but as a woman accustomed to spaces that reflected her extraordinary life. She was the daughter of George Pullman, whose luxurious railway sleeping cars had redefined American travel and made the family one of the wealthiest in the nation. From childhood, Harriet had moved through ballrooms, winter estates, and palatial residences, as if they were extensions of her own world. She learned early that a home was not merely a shelter, it was a statement, a performance, a signal to society of one's standing and aspirations. When she and her husband Frank began searching for a California retreat, Harriet was not drawn to the grandest property or the largest parcel of land. Instead, she sought a place with character, a residence that already carried an air of European elegance, one that could match the sophistication she had absorbed during her upbringing. When she stepped onto the grounds of the Baldwin estate, the symmetry and refinement of the mansion struck her immediately. The French facade, the polished details, the balanced proportions, it all resonated with the aesthetic she admired. But more than that, the house offered a sense of possibility. It felt like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. She walked through sunlit rooms that seemed almost prepared for gatherings, music, and conversation. She noticed the gentle echo of footsteps along the polished floors, as though the space was designed for a woman who enjoyed hosting soirées and welcoming influential guests. From the terrace, she saw the vineyard stretching outward in perfectly aligned rows, creating a natural backdrop that resembled the orderly gardens of the estates she had visited in Europe. And in that view, Harriet recognized the same promise that had once drawn the Baldwins here, the chance to shape not only a home, but an experience. The mansion offered refinement without ostentation, beauty without excess, and enough distance from the bustle of city life to create a world of its own. Yet it also sat close enough to San Francisco society to remain relevant, accessible, and visible. It was the ideal balance for someone like Harriet, who valued privacy but thrived in social circles where elegance and spectacle were currencies of their own. From the moment she acquired the estate, the house seemed to respond to her presence. Rooms that had been dormant awakened with activity. Lanterns flickered along garden paths on warm evenings. Carriages rolled up the long drive, followed in later years by early automobiles. The house had been built with an aristocratic spirit, and now it finally had an owner who matched that intention. Someone capable of elevating its aura from charming vineyard residence to a true showpiece of West Coast high society. For Harriet, choosing this home was not a practical decision. It was an instinctive recognition, a moment in which architecture, landscape, and personal identity aligned. She did not simply move into the mansion. She stepped into a role it had silently been holding for her, becoming the figure who would bring its French-inspired design into its most luminous and dramatic era. The estate, once elegant but reserved, now had a queen, and its transformation into a center of Gilded Age glamour was only beginning. Under Harriet's direction, the mansion shed its quiet vineyard tranquility and blossomed into a vibrant social landmark, a gathering place for an emerging class of West Coast elites eager to define their own version of sophistication. Almost immediately, the estate began to pulse with activity. Workers trimmed pathways, refurbished terraces, and shaped the surrounding gardens into elegant outdoor rooms that seemed designed for celebration. As preparations unfolded, the house itself appeared to come alive, as though aware that its role had expanded beyond agriculture and family life into something far more theatrical. Evenings on the estate transformed the grounds into a spectacle that few in the Santa Clara Valley had ever witnessed. Electric lights, still a novelty in many households, were strung among the trees in soft, glowing lines, illuminating the vineyard rows like a procession of lanterns stretching into the distance. Guests would arrive just after sunset, guided by the shimmer of these lights as if approaching a private festival. Once past the entrance, they stepped into an atmosphere of coordinated grandeur, musicians tuning their instruments, tables set with delicate china, and the faint aroma of wine drifting upward from the old stone cellars. Harriet orchestrated these affairs with the precision of someone who had attended the finest events in New York and Chicago. She understood the value of ambience, the interplay of sound, movement, and visual delight, and used the architecture of the mansion as the structure around which her gatherings unfolded. The French-inspired facade became a luminous backdrop for dancing, while the garden terraces acted as open-air salons where guests in tailored suits and sweeping gowns mingled beneath the warm California sky. The estate soon became known for its elaborate fêtes, where orchestral music drifted across the grounds long into the night. One evening might feature an ensemble performing on the lawn near a glowing fountain. Another might culminate in a firework display that painted the vineyard slopes in bursts of color. Conversation spilled through the veranda doors, laughter echoed down the walkways, and the house itself seemed to absorb every sound, every footstep, every note of music, as though gathering these moments into its walls. Word of these gatherings spread quickly. The Bay Area was entering a period of transformation, its wealthy families growing in number and influence, and many were seeking new spaces to display their modern prosperity. San Francisco's older elite still held their established venues and traditions, but the younger generation, railroad heirs, entrepreneurs, and ambitious social leaders, looked southward toward estates like this one, where the formality of the East blended with the ease of California living. Le Petit Trianon stood at exactly that intersection. It was refined yet inviting, structured yet free, stately but adaptable to the outdoor lifestyle that defined the region. Here, people could celebrate beneath the stars without sacrificing elegance. They could dance on a terrace that evoked Versailles, yet enjoy the scent of nearby orchards carried by the night breeze. For guests accustomed to city mansions or coastal resorts, the estate offered a setting unlike any other. This unique combination drew the emerging social circles of the West Coast to the property again and again. Connections were formed under glowing strings of bulbs, introductions were made beside the garden's fountains, and alliances, both personal and professional, were shaped within the mansion's luminous halls. The estate became a symbol not only of Harriet's taste, but of a new cultural identity growing in California, confident, outward-looking, ready to stand beside the established centers of American wealth. As these gatherings multiplied, the house entered a new phase of its existence. No longer just a vineyard residence or a French-inspired curiosity, it evolved into a true social landmark, a place so alive with movement and conversation that each event felt like another chapter in a grand unfolding story. And with every celebration, the mansion's reputation strengthened, preparing it for an even more ambitious purpose in the years ahead. As Harriet's gatherings grew in scale and ambition, the estate began to shed its identity as a charming, French-inspired residence and step into a far more audacious role. It was no longer simply a beautiful backdrop for California society. It was becoming a declaration. Every celebration, every orchestral performance, every perfectly orchestrated evening signaled that this house, and the woman who presided over it, intended to stand shoulder to shoulder with the legendary venues of the Gilded Age. In time, the comparisons to Versailles no longer felt exaggerated. They felt almost inevitable. Harriet approached entertaining the way others approached diplomacy. She treated each event as an opportunity to shape influence, strengthen alliances, and display a level of refinement that few West Coast households could match. Her guest lists reflected it. Railroad heirs, prominent bankers, visiting dignitaries, European travelers seeking connections in the growing American West. They arrived curious about the mansion and left astonished by its transformation into a miniature kingdom, one ruled not by monarchy, but by a woman whose taste and resources allowed her to stage experiences that felt rare even to the wealthy. Some of the most memorable gatherings unfolded during the years surrounding the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. As international guests arrived in California, royal envoys, diplomats, artists, and industrialists, the region's most powerful families competed to entertain them. The Crockers, long established at the top of San Francisco's social pyramid, hosted their own lavish gatherings. But Harriet, with her Pullman fortune and a flair for spectacle, was determined not to be overshadowed. In those months, the estate seemed to exist in a heightened state of activity. Preparations began weeks in advance. Gardeners sculpted ornate pathways, carpenters built temporary stages, and caterers assembled elaborate menus featuring imported delicacies. Harriet oversaw every detail personally. Outdoor lanterns were arranged in patterns that mimicked the illuminated promenades of European garden estates. Musicians were brought in from the city, their ensembles carefully chosen for the mood of each evening. Even the vineyards played a role, illuminated at night, so that the rows themselves became part of the scenery, extending the visual magic far beyond the terrace where guests gathered. European visitors, accustomed to old-world palaces and aristocratic gatherings, found themselves surprisingly captivated by the Carolan estate. There was something uniquely enchanting about standing on a terrace that echoed Versailles while looking out over California's orchards, lit by modern electric bulbs and framed by distant mountains. The combination of European inspiration and Western frontier vitality made every event feel both familiar and unexpected, as though Harriet had successfully merged the two worlds into a single, cohesive experience. One evening might begin with a champagne reception beneath the oak trees, followed by a string quartet performing near the garden steps. Another might unfold across the entire property. Musicians stationed in different corners of the estate, fountains illuminated as though glowing from within, and pathways lined with decorative arches that guided guests toward hidden alcoves where dessert tables awaited. The finale of these nights often involved a display of lights or fireworks, subtle at times, extravagant at others. The guests would gather along the lawns as shimmering colors rose above the vineyards, and for a few moments the estate felt suspended in time, an echo of European monarchies, reimagined through Harriet's West Coast vision. These gatherings cemented the estate's reputation as a centerpiece of California's emerging high society. It was no longer enough to be wealthy or well-connected. One needed to be seen at the Carolan estate to take part in the experiences Harriet curated with such precision. Newspapers occasionally hinted at the events, describing them as elegant, refined, and exceptionally well-attended. But even those who read the accounts could not fully understand the immersive atmosphere unless they had stepped onto the grounds in person. The mansion had become synonymous with Harriet's identity. Bold, yet graceful, refined, yet undeniably modern. Yet, even in the glow of this success, something quieter stirred beneath the surface. As Harriet stood in the center of these events, welcoming foreign dignitaries, conversing with California's elite, accepting compliments on the estate's beauty, she felt an impulse she could not ignore. Le Petit Trianon had been the perfect stage for this chapter of her life, but Harriet was a woman who grew restless when her surroundings failed to keep pace with her ambitions. The estate was exquisite, yes, but to her, it suddenly began to seem small. The rooms that once felt expansive now appeared modest. The grandeur she presented to society was genuine, yet she knew she was capable of crafting something even more extraordinary. The mansion had served her beautifully, elevating her presence in West Coast society and offering a space where she could shape her identity. But it also awakened an appetite for a level of magnificence that went far beyond what even this French-inspired villa could offer. It was not dissatisfaction, it was evolution. The estate had made her a queen of California society, and now she envisioned a palace that would match that title without compromise. Somewhere, just beyond the horizon of these glittering nights, a much grander dream was already taking form. As the last echoes of music drifted across the vineyard lawns and the glow of lanterns faded into the early morning haze, Harriet often found herself standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the estate that had carried her so gracefully into the heart of California society. The symmetry of the mansion still charmed her, the vineyards still cast their orderly patterns across the valley, and the French facades still shimmered softly in the shifting light. Yet beneath her admiration lay a restlessness she could no longer ignore. The gatherings were growing larger, the guest lists longer, the ambitions sharper, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the house began to feel less like a grand stage and more like a beautifully decorated boundary. It was not that Le Petit Trianon lacked elegance. It radiated charm in every detail, but Harriet's world was expanding beyond its walls. She had seen palatial homes on the East Coast, toured European estates with hundreds of rooms, and grown up inside her family's Chicago mansion, a place so large it required permanent staff simply to maintain its rhythm. Her California residence, with all its grace and refinement, suddenly seemed too intimate, too contained. She wanted galleries where visitors could wander for hours, ballrooms capable of hosting orchestras, sweeping staircases that announced a guest's arrival before they even entered the room. She craved a scale that evoked not just European inspiration, but European majesty. This desire crystallized into a single decision. She would build something entirely new, something vast, something unprecedented in the region. She purchased more than 500 acres of land in Hillsborough, a place where the rolling hills offered the grandeur she needed for her new vision. And there, she set in motion a project that would soon redefine architectural ambition on the West Coast, a 65,000 square foot French chateau known as Carolan's. Once the plans were drawn, the difference in scale between Carolan's and Le Petit Trianon became clear even to casual observers. The Cupertino mansion, though elegant, could have fit several times over inside the footprint of the new residence Harriet envisioned. Carolan's would feature dozens of rooms dedicated solely to entertaining. It would have a grand staircase inspired by European palaces, a ballroom large enough for elaborate formal galas, and a layout that required dozens of staff members to maintain daily operations. It was a home designed not for gatherings, but for spectacles. As construction began, Harriet's attention shifted with it. Architects, decorators, and estate planners filled her days. She reviewed stone samples, furniture catalogs, and landscape renderings that stretched the boundaries of imagination. The excitement of creation, of building something that matched her identity and aspirations, pulled her forward with unstoppable force. In contrast, the familiar halls of Le Petit Trianon began to feel frozen in time, as though the house had reached the limits of what it could offer her. Yet, even as her dreams expanded, the Cupertino mansion remained a meaningful chapter in her life. It had been her introduction to California high society, a haven for her most dazzling events, and a stage on which she had firmly established her presence on the West Coast. But now, with Carolan's rising stone by stone, the earlier intimacy of Le Petit Trianon no longer aligned with the scale of her ambitions. It was not a failure of the house. It was a natural evolution of Harriet's personal arc. The shift in her attention inevitably changed the mansion's atmosphere. The celebrations became less frequent, the grounds quieter, the rooms more still. What had once been a lively center of elite gatherings gradually stepped back into a gentler existence. The house did not fall into neglect, but it no longer pulsed with the energy it had known during Harriet's busiest years. Instead, it waited, observing, absorbing, adjusting to its new place in her story. And there, in that stillness, a question lingered over the estate. If the house had been built to reflect the aspirations of its owners, what would become of it now that Harriet's aspirations had grown beyond its walls? The answer was not yet clear, but the shift marked the beginning of a new, more uncertain chapter for the mansion, a chapter shaped not by ambition, but by the space left behind when a dream outgrows its first home. The atmosphere around the estate began to shift long before anyone said it aloud. During the height of Harriet's social season, the mansion had thrummed with constant motion, carriages rattling up the drive, music drifting through open windows, laughter weaving its way through the gardens. But as construction on her new Hillsborough chateau absorbed more of her energy, subtle cracks began to appear not only in the rhythm of life at Le Petit Trianon, but in the foundation of her marriage to Frank Carolan. Their partnership, once united by ambition and shared social aspirations, gradually lost its harmony as the demands of their expanding world pulled them in separate directions. Harriet spent increasing stretches of time away from the estate, traveling between California and the East Coast, where her family connections and social obligations continued to grow. Frank, rooted more firmly in California, remained closer to the life they had built there. The distance between them was not measured only in geography, but in temperament. Frank preferred a quieter, steadier existence, one tied to business and familiar routines. Harriet, moving in ever more dazzling circles, found herself drawn to environments that offered the scale and drama she had begun to expect. The divergence in their lifestyles created a tension that seeped silently into the rooms of the mansion. The once frequent gatherings became occasional events, and eventually, rare ones. Servants who had spent years preparing for elaborate parties now found themselves attending mostly to daily upkeep, maintaining a house that seemed to have misplaced its own purpose. Large salons that once hosted orchestras and elegantly dressed guests stood empty for weeks at a time. Dust collected more quickly on polished surfaces, as though the house itself sensed that its era of brilliance was slipping away. Even the vineyards, still productive, felt quieter. The paths that had once echoed with footsteps now carried only the sound of the wind moving through the rows. When Harriet did return to the estate, her visits were brief and often overshadowed by pressing concerns elsewhere. She moved through the rooms with a sense of detachment, acknowledging their beauty, but no longer absorbing it. The spaces that had once reflected her personality, vibrant, polished, full of potential, now felt too small, too static, too tied to a life she no longer fully inhabited. The mansion responded in kind. It seemed to brace itself each time she departed, as if aware that her presence was slipping further into memory. Frank's relationship with the house was different. He remained loyal to it in a quiet, steadfast way, continuing to oversee operations and maintain the property. Yet even he could not ignore the sense that something essential had changed. The home no longer reflected his wife's identity, nor did it reflect a shared vision for their future. It had become a reminder of a chapter that was losing its coherence, a symbol of an elegance that no longer matched the realities of their marriage. As silence settled over rooms once filled with elaborate gatherings, the house began to feel the fragility of human connections. How quickly a place can lose its purpose when the people who gave it life drift away from one another. The grand architecture remained intact. The vineyards still curved gently around the estate, but the emotional core of the home had begun to hollow out. Its walls, which once held the warmth of celebration, now held a kind of wistful suspension, as though waiting for something that might never return. With each passing month, the mansion grew more aware of the inevitability forming around it. The ties that had once bound Harriet to this place were unraveling thread by thread, and the estate sensed that its role in her life was nearing an end. The stillness deepened, the halls grew emptier, and the house, which had once seemed destined for perpetual grandeur, stood on the edge of a quiet loneliness. Soon, it would stand completely on its own. When Harriet finally turned her attention fully toward the East Coast, the shift was not abrupt, but felt like the culmination of a long, gradual drift. Her life had always been intertwined with the circles of influence in New York, Boston, and Chicago, and as her social responsibilities expanded, the gravitational pull of those cities grew stronger. What began as occasional extended visits eventually became a permanent transition. She settled into a new rhythm, surrounded by the architecture, culture, and society that had shaped her upbringing, and in doing so, she left behind the California estate that had once served as the brightest expression of her ambitions. On the East Coast, her life unfolded with fresh complexity. She married Colonel Arthur Schermerhorn, a figure firmly embedded in the aristocratic fabric of New York society, and together they introduced a level of formal grace into their shared households. Their residences, from a refined Park Avenue apartment to a serene estate in Lenox, Massachusetts, reflected the classical grandeur she had always admired. The scale, the staff, the setting, all matched her expectations of how a woman of her background should live. And in these new surroundings, Harriet found a renewed sense of identity, a space that aligned more closely with her refined tastes than the now quiet California mansion could offer. With each passing season, her connection to Le Petit Trianon faded, not out of neglect, but out of the inevitability of distance. Her correspondence with California grew less frequent, and the estate became more of a place she referenced rather than visited. The long journeys west, once filled with anticipation and purpose, no longer held the same allure. Her future lay firmly in the refined salons and structured routines of East Coast high society, where her roles as wife, hostess, and heiress continued to evolve in ways that felt more aligned with her present life. Back in California, the mansion responded to her absence with a stillness that settled gradually over the grounds. Without Harriet's direction, the estate no longer reflected the intense energy of social competition or the meticulous planning that once animated every event. Rooms remained beautiful but unused, their furnishings positioned just as she had left them, as though frozen in a moment waiting to be resumed. The gardens continued to bloom, though without the flourish and spectacle of earlier years, and the vineyards carried on with their quiet cycles of growth and harvest. Frank had already departed the world stage, leaving behind his own set of unresolved matters, which only deepened the sense of transition surrounding the estate. The house, for the first time in its history, existed without a guiding figure whose vision shaped its purpose. The Baldwins had built it, Harriet had elevated it, and now it stood under no particular command, neither neglected nor celebrated, merely present. Its stately facade still caught the sunlight in the same elegant patterns, but behind its windows, a new kind of silence settled, one created not by solitude but by the absence of direction. In this lull, the mansion revealed something it had never shown before. It could endure without an owner who demanded grand gestures from it. The estate waited, steady and patient, holding within its walls the imprint of everything it had witnessed, the laughter of guests, the hum of orchestras, the quiet tensions that had passed through its rooms. And as Harriet established her life far across the country, the house remained a physical reminder of a chapter she had outgrown, a place whose story would now continue without the woman who had once defined it so completely. By 1940, the mansion had already settled into a quieter existence, its former brilliance softened by years of reduced activity and the absence of its most formidable owner. When it finally passed into the hands of a new proprietor, the transition felt less like a sale and more like the closing of a long and intricate chapter. The estate, once animated by the ambitions of the Baldwins and the dazzling social life crafted by Harriet, now entered a period defined not by grandeur, but by inevitability. Ownership changed, and with it, the tone of the entire property shifted. The new era arrived without ceremony. There were no grand announcements or celebrations marking the occasion. Instead, the estate simply continued forward under different stewardship, adapting to a world that was changing fast around it. California of the 1940s bore little resemblance to the pastoral landscape the mansion had originally overlooked. The orchards that once surrounded the property were shrinking as new roads, housing developments, and modern businesses began to define the region's growth. The valley was stepping toward its future, and the transformation left places like the old estate standing in quiet contrast to the expanding suburban horizon. With each passing year, the gardens, once carefully shaped into elegant outdoor rooms, began to lose their form. Pathways blurred beneath creeping plants, fountains slowed to stillness, and the meticulous borders that had surrounded flower beds loosened until the original designs became difficult to recognize. Nature reclaimed the grounds with a slow, unhurried patience, softening the straight lines and carefully measured geometry that had once imitated the garden traditions of Europe. Even the vineyards, a symbol of the estate's earliest identity, started to recede. Some were cleared for new uses, others simply withered, their caretakers long gone. Inside the mansion, time expressed itself differently. The structure remained sturdy, its French-inspired features still elegant in the shifting light, but the rooms carried an unmistakable sense of distance from their former purpose. Where orchestras once tuned their instruments, there was now only the faint hum of an aging house adjusting to changing seasons. The floors, once polished for gatherings, now reflected the duller sheen of practical maintenance. Light that had once danced across tables set for elite parties now fell onto bare surfaces or draped furniture. The house was still beautiful, but its beauty had become a quiet, spectral thing, something inherited rather than actively expressed. Outside the estate's boundaries, the world seemed to press forward without pause. The Santa Clara Valley was becoming part of a modern narrative, one shaped less by agriculture and more by innovation, suburban planning, and expanding infrastructure. In contrast, the mansion remained firmly anchored in the aesthetics and ideals of an earlier time. Its walls carried the echo of centuries-old architectural influences, while the world around it embraced progress, efficiency, and urban expansion. That contrast created a palpable tension. The house had been designed to endure, but endurance alone was no guarantee of relevance in a rapidly evolving region. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the property felt increasingly like a relic, an elegant survivor, but one whose purpose was growing hazy. Visitors who happened upon the estate saw a house that was still impressive, but strangely adrift, standing at a crossroads between preservation and disappearance. Without the vivid social life that once animated it, without the flourishing vineyards that had defined its earliest identity, and without a strong guiding hand to steer its future, the mansion seemed to hover in uncertainty. The surrounding landscape continued to shift, and with each change, the estate's once prominent place in the valley became a little more obscure. Roads grew busier, nearby properties developed, and the quiet isolation that had once made the mansion feel like a private world now contributed to its sense of abandonment. The story it held within its walls, the triumphs, the elegance, the ambition, felt increasingly fragile, as though it could slip unnoticed into the shadows of modernization. As the chapter of the 1940s closed, the estate stood in a delicate balance. Its architecture still whispered of France, its rooms still remembered the brilliance of earlier decades, and its presence still commanded attention from those who paused to look. But it was no longer clear whether those qualities would be enough to protect it from what might come next. For the first time in its existence, the possibility lingered that the magnificent story of this house, so rich in transformations and triumphs, could quietly fade away. And if the world around it continued to change at this pace, the mansion's next chapter, if it even had one, would depend not on its past glories, but on the fragile hope that someone, somewhere, would decide it was worth saving. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Santa Clara Valley had begun shedding its old identity with astonishing speed. The region that once moved at the gentle pace of agriculture, defined by orchards, vineyards, and quiet rural estates, suddenly found itself swept into a technological tide that no one could have predicted a generation earlier. New industries were rising, research facilities were expanding, and the landscape itself seemed to tilt toward a future shaped not by harvest cycles, but by circuitry, innovation, and an appetite for growth that felt almost electric. The valley was still beautiful, still sunlit and framed by mountains, but beneath the surface a transformation was unfolding that would soon rename it Silicon Valley. The orchards surrounding the old estate were among the first to feel the pressure. Land once prized for fruit trees was now valued for its potential as sites for laboratories, corporate campuses, and educational institutions that could support the burgeoning tech landscape. Surveyors walked fields where grapevines had once grown, marking out new boundaries and imagining a radically different future for the valley. Bulldozers arrived not with the intention of erasing history, but with the determination to prepare the ground for a new world. Each development, each blueprint, and each rezoning decision pushed the region further from its pastoral past and closer to the technological powerhouse it was destined to become. Amid this upheaval, the mansion remained remarkably unchanged. Its French facade still rose with the same poised elegance. The remnants of its gardens still clung to symmetry, even as nature softened their lines. But the contrast between the house and its surroundings grew sharper every year. It stood like a memory in the middle of progress, a moment from another era preserved in timber and stucco, now watched by young professionals, students, and developers who saw its presence as curious rather than familiar. The estate's vintage charm, once a point of pride, now appeared almost out of place among the shifting priorities of the valley. It was during this period that discussions began about the need for new educational facilities to support the region's expanding population. The technological boom brought not only businesses, but families, students, and workers eager for academic opportunities. The concept of a new community college took shape, and the bold idea of placing it on the former Beaulieu property soon followed. The land's location, central, spacious, and conveniently positioned, made it a natural fit for a large-scale institution that could evolve alongside the valley's growing industries. Thus, the foundations of what would become De Anza College were laid directly on the historic grounds that had once echoed with outdoor concerts and social gatherings. The redevelopment of the estate introduced a strange new reality for the mansion. Instead of vineyards, it was now surrounded by architectural models, construction equipment, and the early outlines of classroom buildings. Where elegant carriages once rolled up the drive, trucks now delivered materials. The hum of machinery replaced the soft rustle of grapevines. The estate watched as its familiar world dissolved into a vision of lecture halls, administrative offices, and walkways designed for thousands of students. It was an evolution so dramatic that the house almost felt like a museum exhibit trapped inside a rapidly moving future. Yet, with progress came uncertainty. As plans for De Anza College advanced, the mansion's fate became a topic of debate. Some saw it as a charming relic with historical value, but others viewed it as an obstacle to efficient development. It was large, it was old, and it stood precisely where new academic structures were needed. In the logic of modern planning, a 19th-century estate did not easily fit into a grid of concrete pathways and educational facilities designed for the tech-driven decades ahead. For the first time since the Baldwins laid its foundation, the mansion faced a genuine existential threat, not from neglect or abandonment, but from the unstoppable march of progress. The valley's transformation into a technological hub promised opportunity and growth, yet it carried with it the possibility that the estate might simply disappear in the name of modernization. The house had survived changes in ownership, shifts in cultural taste, and decades of evolving landscapes, but the rise of Silicon Valley presented a new challenge. It demanded relevance or removal. As construction began around it, the mansion stood in a peculiar limbo. It was admired by some, ignored by others, and evaluated by planners who understood the pressure to build quickly for a growing population of students. In this moment of uncertainty, the house felt more vulnerable than it had during any previous transition. The land that once nourished vineyards was now preparing for classrooms, and the building that had once symbolized refinement now stood at risk of being considered an inconvenience. The question that hovered over the estate grew heavier with each passing month. Could a house built to reflect the elegance of Versailles survive in a valley that was rapidly reinventing itself as the heart of global innovation? The answer, whatever it would be, hinged not on the mansion's beauty or its history, but on whether anyone believed its story was still worth protecting in a world that was moving faster than ever before. By 1968, the campus of De Anza College was beginning to take shape with the confident geometry of modern institutional planning. New buildings rose steadily around the old estate, each one embodying the minimalist, functional sensibilities of the era. Concrete, steel, and glass became the dominant materials of the valley's new architecture, reflecting a mindset that valued efficiency, expansion, and a clean break from the ornate past. In the midst of this momentum, the French-inspired mansion, quiet, aging, and undeniably out of step with the streamlined future, found itself facing a drastic verdict. The decision to demolish the house did not come from malice or disregard, but from the practical logic of the time. The valley was undergoing explosive population growth, and the college needed additional classrooms, parking structures, and student facilities to keep pace. Every square foot of land mattered. Administrators and planners were under pressure to maximize usable space, and the mansion, occupying a central and strategically valuable part of the property, appeared to be standing in the way of progress. To many decision-makers, the estate represented a charming but outdated artifact, an impractical remnant of a bygone era that offered little functional value for a modern educational institution. The architectural trends of the 1960s reinforced this perspective. The prevailing philosophy celebrated clean lines, open space, and buildings designed to serve large populations with minimal upkeep. In contrast, the mansion's ornate facade, carved redwood beams, stucco finishes, and classical proportions required specialized care that few were willing to provide. It did not align with the new aesthetic of modernity, nor did it promise a straightforward path to repurposing. From a planner's standpoint, demolition seemed almost inevitable, a necessary step in reshaping the campus into an efficient environment for thousands of students. Financial considerations also played a role. The house had been standing for more than 70 years, and decades of decreased activity had left their mark on its interior and surrounding grounds. Restoring the building to a usable condition would require funds that the college did not have available, especially during a period when public institutions were prioritizing expansion over preservation. The economic logic was simple. Removing the building would save money, free valuable land, and allow the college to grow unimpeded. Equally important was the cultural mood of the era. Across the United States, historical preservation was not yet widely embraced. Many cities were demolishing old structures, Victorian mansions, historic theaters, ornate commercial buildings, to make room for freeways, office towers, and modern infrastructure. The belief that newer was better permeated planning discussions everywhere. In this context, eliminating an aging estate for the sake of educational progress seemed not only reasonable, but progressive. The idea of preserving such a building for historical significance had not yet reached the urgency it would gain in later decades. As a result, the decision to level the estate was made swiftly, almost clinically. Administrators reviewed maps, assessed campus needs, and approved plans that placed new structures directly where the mansion stood. Meetings were conducted, timelines drafted, and early sketches circulated that showed a future campus in which the elegant house no longer existed. For planners, it was simply a matter of clearing obstacles and streamlining development. For the mansion, it was nothing less than a final sentence. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere felt far more personal. The rooms that had once hosted lavish soirées now processed this new reality in silence. The carved moldings, the gentle arches, the carefully proportioned windows, all stood waiting for their fate, holding the memories of decades while the outside world reimagined the space they occupied. The estate had survived changes in ownership, shifts in cultural style, and the rise of a technological era that rendered many older landmarks obsolete. But this time, the threat was immediate and absolute. The strange part was that the decision genuinely made sense to many. The campus needed space, the valley needed institutions, and the country was shifting its priorities toward a modern, forward-looking world. In a time defined by constant movement and innovation, an old mansion seemed more like a luxury than a necessity. Yet, even as the demolition plans moved forward, a small but growing awareness began to form in the community. An awareness that this house, with all its elegance and history, might be worth more than the land beneath it. Something in its presence still spoke to the valley's past, a reminder of roots that could easily be erased in the rush toward the future. And although no one knew it yet, that quiet murmur of concern would soon grow into resistance strong enough to challenge the fate that had been set for the estate, setting the stage for one of the most unexpected twists in the mansion's long and improbable story. The announcement that the mansion would be demolished spread quietly at first, tucked into administrative notes and local planning discussions. But it didn't take long for the news to reach people who still remembered what the house had once meant to the valley. For decades, it had been more than a structure. It had been a symbol of refinement, ambition, and the unique cultural blend that shaped early California. When word circulated that the estate would be reduced to rubble in the name of campus expansion, something stirred in the community, a sense that a vital piece of the region's identity was about to vanish forever. The first to react were local historians, many of whom had studied the early development of Santa Clara Valley and understood how rare it was for a structure from the 19th century to survive into the age of rapid technological growth. For them, the mansion was not just attractive, it was a tangible link to the valley's transformation from agricultural landscape to global innovation center. They recognized that once the house was gone, no modern building could ever replicate the story embedded in its walls. These historians began voicing concerns at city meetings, writing letters, and gathering documentation that highlighted the structure's architectural and cultural value. Yes. Their efforts soon drew the attention of preservationists, activists who had been fighting similar battles across the region, often losing to the sweeping modernization trend of the 1960s. But in Le Petit Trianon, they saw a rare opportunity. The building was visually striking, historically significant, and intimately tied to figures whose influence extended far beyond California. Even those who didn't know Harriet's full story instinctively understood that the mansion represented an era that deserved acknowledgement rather than erasure. What began as a small circle of advocates grew into a broader coalition of concerned citizens, educators, architects, and ordinary residents who simply felt the old house deserved better. Meetings became public, and public meetings became passionate. Students questioned why beauty should be sacrificed for convenience. Local newspapers printed op-eds arguing that progress should not require erasing history. Some community members drew parallels to other cities where beloved landmarks had been lost, urging their neighbors not to repeat those mistakes. Petition drives circulated across neighborhoods, gathering names and momentum. The conversation shifted from quiet concern to active resistance as people realized that their voices might still influence the outcome. The tension between the college administration and the preservationists grew sharper with each passing week. For the institution, expansion was necessary. Classrooms were crowded, demand was rising, and the future of the college depended on modern facilities. For the community, however, the mansion represented irreplaceable heritage. They insisted that progress and preservation did not need to be enemies, and that the valley could honor its past even as it prepared for a technological future. This clash of priorities eventually forced a broader reevaluation. Experts from state and national preservation organizations were invited to assess the mansion. They examined its redwood construction, its French neoclassical influences, its connection to significant historical figures, and its role in local development. Reports were written, photographs collected, and testimony presented. And slowly, the conversation began to shift. What had once been seen as an old, impractical building started to be recognized as a landmark with rare architectural value, one that told a story far too important to discard. Momentum built until it reached a decisive turning point: the nomination of Le Petit Trianon for a place on the National Register of Historic Places. It was an ambitious move, one that required proving the house's historical significance on a national scale. Community members who had once been casual observers now found themselves advocating passionately, signing letters, attending hearings, and gathering archival material to support the nomination. Their determination transformed what had seemed like a lost cause into a credible campaign. When the official designation finally came in 1972, It felt like an unexpected triumph, an acknowledgement that the house mattered not only to the valley, but to the country. The decision protected the mansion from demolition and ensured that, despite the pressures of modernization, the building would continue to stand as a testament to its era. Relief and celebration spread through the community. People who had never spoken to one another exchanged smiles at the news. Longtime residents felt a surge of pride knowing that their efforts had preserved a piece of their shared identity. This victory did more than save a structure. It demonstrated that history could still influence the future, even in a region racing toward innovation at full speed. It proved that ordinary people, united by a sense of responsibility to the past, could alter the trajectory of a building that seemed destined to disappear. And for the mansion itself, it meant something even more profound. It had been granted the chance to continue its story. But rescue came with new challenges, and survival, though now guaranteed, would require even more unexpected steps. The valley had embraced its legacy, yet the mansion still needed a place within the modern campus. How that place would be found would shape the next extraordinary chapter in its long, unlikely journey. Once the mansion had been officially protected, the question of how to integrate it into the expanding college campus became impossible to ignore. The institution still needed room for new buildings, parking areas, and student facilities, and the French-inspired estate, elegant, immovable, and positioned directly in the path of future development, posed a challenge no ordinary solution could resolve. Demolition was no longer an option, yet leaving the house where it stood would compromise the college's entire long-term plan. What followed was a decision so unlikely, so bold, that it would forever redefine the mansion's story. The house would not be destroyed, and it would not be renovated in place. Instead, it would be moved, literally moved, rolled brick by brick, beam by beam, intact across the campus. At first, the idea seemed almost absurd. Le Petit Trianon was no lightweight wooden cottage. It was a 300-ton structure built of massive redwood beams, stuccoed walls, and carefully crafted interior framing. The mansion contained decades of layered history, intricate woodwork, and structural details that could easily be damaged by even the slightest shift. Yet engineers and preservation experts insisted that it could be done. With enough planning, enough patience, and enough determination, the mansion could be lifted from its foundations and transported like an enormous, fragile sculpture. Preparations began with painstaking care. Crews reinforced the frame from the inside, installing steel supports that would prevent the house from twisting or cracking during the move. The area beneath the mansion was excavated to create space for hydraulic jacks, and a latticework of beams was constructed beneath the structure, forming a temporary skeleton capable of bearing its enormous weight. The basement and cellars, once used for wine storage and later incorporated into the campus landscape, were now fitted with the machinery needed to lift the entire building off the ground. When the moment came to raise the mansion from its foundation, observers described the sight as almost surreal. The structure seemed to hover for a moment. Suspended above the earth it had rested on for nearly a century, it remained perfectly still, its columns and shutters unshaken, as if the house itself understood the gravity of the moment. Then, inch by inch, it was moved onto a system of large wheeled platforms, slow, heavy, and engineered, with a precision normally reserved for moving industrial equipment or massive sculptures. The house was no longer rooted in place. It had become a traveler. The first journey took the mansion across the campus to make room for the Flint Center, a major performing arts venue whose construction required the land where the house originally stood. The route was carefully plotted to avoid slopes, uneven ground, or obstacles that could jar the structure. Workers guided the platforms across the terrain with a methodical pace, adjusting each movement with quiet coordination. Students gathered along pathways, watching in disbelief as the mansion glided past like a regal ship drifting across calm waters. Some described it as though the house were performing its own parade, silently marking its resilience in the face of change. Once the house reached its new location, engineers lowered it gently onto a prepared foundation. But the story did not end there. Some years later, as the campus continued to evolve, planners realized that the house's second location was no longer suitable for the long-term layout of De Anza College. And so, in an astonishing repeat of the first feat, Le Petit Trianon was moved again. The process, although familiar, was no less remarkable the second time. This time, the move was even more delicate. The structure had aged further, and the logistics were even more complex due to new buildings nearby. But once again, engineers and preservationists succeeded, guiding the 300-ton mansion across campus with the deliberate care of artisans restoring a priceless artifact. These moves were not simply practical measures. They became symbols of what the valley valued. In an era defined by technological progress, where buildings were often replaced instead of restored, moving the mansion showcased a rare commitment to heritage. It represented a bridge between eras, the agrarian past, the gilded social world of Harriet, and the rapidly modernizing Silicon Valley. Technical publications praised the feat as an engineering marvel. Local newspapers ran photos of the mansion in motion, calling it one of the most unusual preservation efforts California had ever seen. For the house itself, the moves became a kind of rebirth. It had been built to stand firm, yet it proved that it could adapt, shifting gracefully across the campus even as the world around it changed beyond recognition. It survived because people believed it deserved to, and because those people possessed the ingenuity to make the impossible happen. And when the mansion finally settled into its new and final position, resting securely on a fresh foundation, it carried with it the extraordinary memory of having walked, not metaphorically, but literally, through history. By the early 1980s, after years of upheaval, 2 relocations, and more than a decade of uncertainty, the mansion finally stood on stable ground, a survivor poised for renewal. The community that had rescued it from demolition now turned its attention to the next challenge, restoring the estate to the elegance it once embodied. After so many years of quiet erosion, deferred maintenance, and the physical stress of being lifted, rolled, and lowered twice, the house needed far more than superficial repairs. It required a revival that honored its origins while respecting the extraordinary journey it had endured. The restoration effort that unfolded was meticulous, patient, and almost reverent. Craftspeople approached the mansion with the careful precision of conservators working on a rare artifact. The first task was to assess its condition after decades of neglect and the stress of relocation. Engineers inspected the framing for any hidden strain, while artisans studied the original redwood walls to determine how much of the historic material could be preserved. Each room told a different story. Some still bore the fine detailing from the Baldwin era, others carried traces of Harriet's time, and others yet showed the scars of long disuse. The goal was not to erase these impressions, but to restore a sense of coherence, dignity, and historical continuity. Specialists in historic architecture recreated details that had faded or been damaged. The delicate window shutters modeled after French precedents, the carved moldings that once framed grand interiors, the decorative finishes that echoed the estate's late 19th century charm. Layers of paint, applied hastily over the decades, were carefully removed to reveal original textures hidden beneath. Floors were refinished, not simply polished, but treated with the same methods used during the mansion's earliest years, allowing the wood to glow with a warmth that hinted at the gatherings and footsteps of generations past. Where features had been lost entirely, restoration teams relied on old photographs, architectural drawings, and archival descriptions to recreate them with remarkable accuracy. Even the garden surroundings were reimagined, trimmed, shaped, and revived to suggest the formal spirit of the estate's earliest landscapes. Though the vineyards were long gone, traces of their orderly symmetry were invoked in the layout of paths and plantings, creating a subtle echo of the estate's agricultural beginnings. Room by room, the house regained its composure. Spaces that once felt dim and forgotten began to brighten as light returned to the restored windows. The grand entry, scarred by time and relocation, regained its welcoming brilliance. Parlors regained the soft proportions that had made them ideal for quiet conversation, and hallways once worn by years of neglect now carried an understated elegance that honored their French inspirations. Visitors who walked through the mansion during this period often described a feeling of witnessing a house awakening from a long sleep, stretching, settling, and reclaiming its identity. By 1982, when the restoration was officially completed, the transformation was astonishing. From the outside, the mansion looked almost untouched by time, its facade smooth and luminous, its shutters perfectly aligned, its proportions once again reflecting the harmony envisioned by Willis Polk nearly a century earlier. Inside, the rooms carried a renewed sense of dignity, as though they remembered their original purpose: to host, to inspire, to offer beauty and refinement to everyone who passed through their doors. Yet beneath the pristine surfaces, the house retained the memory of everything it had endured. Behind the walls were reinforced beams placed there during the moves. Beneath the floors were traces of earlier foundations left behind, as the house had been lifted and carried across the campus. The mansion appeared serene, almost effortless in its elegance, but those who knew its history understood that the calm beauty was the result of resilience, not luck. It stood now as both an artifact and a survivor, restored to its former grace, yet bearing the invisible marks of every chapter it had lived through. And in that restored dignity, the house offered a quiet reminder: elegance can be recreated, beauty can be revived, but the true character of a place comes from the endurance written within its bones. In its restored state, the mansion entered a phase unlike anything it had known before. No longer an extravagant stage for vineyard dinners or the glittering soirées of Harriet's Gilded era, it now opened its doors with a quieter, more contemplative purpose. The elegance remained, but it was directed toward reflection rather than performance. The house, once a symbol of personal prestige, was reborn as a place where the public could engage with the stories embedded in its walls. Stories of early California, of architectural ambition, of social transformation, and of perseverance in the face of disappearance. Inside, the rooms that had once echoed with music and conversation found new life as spaces devoted to learning. Exhibits lined the halls, each one carefully curated to reveal different dimensions of the valley's past. Photographs of orchards, early settlements, and the rise of regional industries contrasted with displays showing the estate's wine-producing origins and its transformation under Harriet's ownership. The mansion's own journey, its construction, decline, near-demolition, and extraordinary relocations, became one of the centerpieces of this narrative, allowing visitors to explore how the house survived the dramatic shifts that reshaped the region. The Stocklemere Library and Archives found its home within these restored rooms, filling them with manuscripts, journals, oral histories, maps, and fragile documents that once belonged to students, scholars, farmers, and community leaders. Here, researchers traced the evolution of the Santa Clara Valley from agricultural heartland to technological powerhouse. Students from De Anza College settled into reading tables beneath ornate ceilings, unaware that they were studying in a room where, decades earlier, elite guests had once gathered for candlelit dinners. Archivists worked quietly, preserving materials that captured the region's changing identity, while local historians used the space to uncover the forgotten voices that shaped California. Lectures and workshops filled the mansion with a steady rhythm of activity. Community groups met in rooms that had once hosted orchestras. Visiting professors delivered talks in spaces where Harriet's guests once mingled beneath strings of lantern light. The building adapted to each new use without losing its sense of presence. It became a living archive, a place where the past was not simply displayed, but interpreted, questioned, and woven into the present. What made this transformation so profound was not just the mansion's function, but its symbolism. The house would never again serve a single owner or reflect the ambitions of one family. Instead, it belonged to the public, to the generations who walked through its doors, seeking insight into the history that shaped their community. It had survived more than most buildings ever face: the decline of its original estate, the departure of its most illustrious resident, the spread of suburbia, the rise of Silicon Valley, 2 full relocations across a campus, and the real threat of permanent loss. Through all of it, the mansion endured not by accident, but because people believed it deserved to stand. Walking through the quiet halls today, one can sense both the continuity and the transformation. The sunlight still filters through the same windows that illuminated the Baldwin family, and later, Harriet's glittering gatherings. The grand proportions remain, as do the architectural flourishes that once evoked the elegance of French palaces. Yet the energy inside is different, gentler, more thoughtful, shaped not by spectacle, but by curiosity. The house feels at peace, fulfilling a purpose that aligns perfectly with its long, winding history. In the end, Le Petit Trianon has become something far more significant than a residence. It is a storyteller, one that speaks not through a single narrative, but through the many layers of memory preserved within its walls. It stands as a testament to the valley's evolution, to the people who shaped it, and to the community that refused to let its heritage disappear. And in this final chapter of its journey, the mansion reveals the quiet triumph at the heart of its survival. It has outlived its builders, its most dazzling occupants, and every force that tried to erase it. It has walked across the land, endured upheaval and reinvention, and emerged with renewed purpose. Today, it stands not as a remnant of the past, but as a guardian of it, an enduring reminder that history, when protected with care, can continue to illuminate the future.